elsewhere. It's just a marvelous institution, and so I really appreciate them as well. I also want to thank the University of Massachusetts Press, which this is our third collaboration, and they just do an outstanding job with cover design, with production, and I also want to thank Kathleen Lafferty, who's back there somewhere, at the very back, who has worked with me off and on many books as editor, copy editor, as organizer of a conference with me in Baltimore, and as gadfly and person who pursues the details when I don't. So we have a lot of fun working together, and I appreciate your coming over from Leverett. And I appreciate all of you being here. Thanks a lot. It's great. I thought, how will I start to introduce myself? And I realized that I had the perfect segue by telling you who I am not first. I was over on campus last week. I actually don't get over there that often these days. I have an office here in town, and Barbara and I live in town in Florence. But I was over on campus, and I was introduced to a staff person who I had not met before, and I won't say where because you may guess who she is. And she came up to me effusively and said, "Oh, I'm so glad to meet you. I really loved your tree books." And I said, "No, I'm sorry, that was my dad, Rutherford Platt, without an H, who wrote a great many natural history books, some of them with Walt Disney and many of them on his own and so forth. And he was quite a writer and a great photographer." So she said, "Oh, well then," I'm waiting for my son to arrive so I can embarrass him. She said, "Oh, you're the expert on Chinese history." "No, that's my son, Steve Platt, who is on the faculty at UMass and has preceded me on this podium as the author of Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, and he'll be here shortly. And she didn't know about my nephew, Rutherford V. Platt, who is also a geographer, or she probably would have confused me with him. At any rate, I'm none of those. I am me, and I cover quite a bit of ground in my own interests. It's hard to pin me down. I started off life in New York City. I was born there. I lived there until going away to college, essentially. So I am a New Yorker, but I'm also a Chicagoan. I went there for graduate school. Actually, my law degree was from the University of Chicago rather than Yale, but that's all right. Either one is fine. And undergraduate at Yale. And then I segued from law into geography through a family connection that is explained very briefly in the preface to Reclaiming American Cities. My uncle had been professor of geography at the University of Chicago, and I sort of gravitated into that world, so to speak, and stuck it out with law school, but then moved across the Midway and got a doctorate in geography when Chicago was the leading department in the country in the field of geography. I then moved to a job downtown while I was still in the graduate program with Open Lands Project, and that's where this all began. That's why I'm running this history past you. Open Lands was a fledgling do-gooder environmental NGO. This was late 60s, about 1968 when I started there. And I was given a free rein by our wonderful Quaker executive director, Gunnar Peterson. Free rein to do almost whatever I wanted. They paid me a salary. I was their staff attorney. And so I did a lot of land projects working with local groups around the Chicago area and in the city, got to know the place pretty well. And so did my wife at that time, Connie Platt, who was here. We both got to a lot of meetings and at night, and it was a very rapid learning experience. So it was then that I began to really get interested in cities, in the greening of cities, and also the social justice side of cities. And I then, however, moved to the University of Massachusetts, assuming a career track and taking a huge loss in self-esteem in the process, because in Chicago I had been writing columns for newspapers, appearing on TV, disagreeing with Richard J. Daley, which was very easy to do on almost anything, such as his plan to put an airport on the bottom of Lake Michigan. I'm not kidding. He really wanted to enclose a ring dike and pump out all the water and put an airport there, right in front of the city. Anyway, that didn't happen. Many people opposed it. But getting to Western Massachusetts, I was, well, Annalise could probably sympathize. You're sort of, it's too nice in some ways. There wasn't, nobody wanted to put an airport in the bottom of anything out here. So I changed track a bit. I became more interested in federal programs and national programs, flood insurance and coastal management, and I was teaching students who were interested in all those things, wetlands. And then I got homesick for Chicago. In 1990, I organized with some colleagues out there a conference called Sustainable Cities. Well, it was a new term at that point. It wasn't as vague and nebulous as it's become. But we had a nice small conference at the Chicago Academy of Sciences, and that then was the first of a whole long series of modest-sized conferences in various parts of the country relating to urban ecology, urban parks and greenways, and to some extent in urban social issues, housing and so forth. The book that came out of that, I should actually have shown you, this was my very first book when I was at Open Lands Project. It's called Open Land in Urban Illinois. Now that's quite direct and specific, and what I'm most proud about, this was 1972, most proud that it has a foreword by Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois, who at that time was earning his place on the cover of Reclaiming American Cities in his work, in his long contributions to the saving of the Indiana Dunes, among many other progressive crusades that he led. But he managed to create the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore through congressional action, which is described in here in Chapter 5. But after that 1990 conference in Chicago, eventually we produced an edited book called The Ecological City, Restoring and Preserving and Restoring Urban Biodiversity. This was 1994, the UMass Press. This was the first book that I published with them. A lot of good co-authors of chapters and experience from cities all over the country. So that was the first prequel to Reclaiming American Cities. In about the year 2000, I started a program called the Ecological Cities Project at UMass in our department, with a lot of students from other parts of the campus as well. And we had courses, we had class assignments and research. We held conferences in various cities, including Boston and Columbia, South Carolina, and Milwaukee. That's where I first met Will Allen. And then we came to New York City, almost a stone's throw from where I grew up, near Gramercy Park. The NYU Law School was at Washington Square was the venue for the Humane Metropolis Symposium that we organized, and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge funded and promoted. It was a great, wonderful collaboration. And there we paid homage or tribute through many people who were friends and family members of William H. White, W-H-Y-T-E, known as Holly White. Holly he was the author of The Organization Man in 56, I think, which convinced me as a schoolboy, when I read some of it, never to be an organization man, and I think I've succeeded in that goal. But anyway, Holly had been our keynote speaker at the 1990 conference in Chicago. After he finished at the last speech of the conference, he went backstage and collapsed. And so we organizers, including my daughter, who was a college student then, and friends and so forth, we stayed, of course, with him, and finally we had him hospitalized, had to get an ambulance. I never saw him in person again. He lived until 1999. Wonderful man, very, very humane. And I took the title of the early book that he published with Jane Jacobs and some other fledgling urban critics in 1958, called The Exploding Metropolis. And I adapted that to the 21st century with the humane metropolis. I said, all right, it's exploded. Sprawl is everywhere. Now what are we going to make of it? So that was the subject of this second edited book with the UMass Press, called The Humane Metropolis, People and Nature in the 21st Century City. And what was another nice feature of this was a DVD, which was actually tucked into the back cover. Probably a lot of people never knew it was there, but one of our grad students made that film with a grant from Lawrence Rockefeller, who also supported the conference in New York. Lawrence, if you aren't familiar with him, was the conservation Rockefeller. He was the one who chaired the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Commission in the early 60s, which led to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and did made enormous contributions to saving of national parks and conservation areas all over. And also, he was the patron for Holly White's work and writing throughout his career. And I first met Holly White in Rockefeller Center on the 57th floor or something like that, in the office of Rockefeller Brothers. So it was really a close connection, and I was so sad that we never had the chance to follow up on his speech and so forth in Chicago. So this was partly in his honor. Well, then the Lincoln Institute, and we continued to organize conferences here and there. After I retired, we held 3 more, one in Pittsburgh, one in Riverside, California, and one in Baltimore in 2009. And the whole idea of these regional meetings was to get the movers and shakers together, the people who were doing stuff at the local level or regionally, but not the bureaucrats, not the technocrats, not the people with their dog and pony shows that come out of Washington or whatever. We had almost no federal or state speakers unless they had some really compelling reason to be on the program. But we dug under the radar and turned up all sorts of really, really neat people in New York, and with the help of local organizers in these other cities. So that was the template, and I learned so much from them. I'd like to just ask you to take a look at the cover and the table of contents for this book, and I'll walk you through it real quickly, and then I'll get to a few little readings, excerpts. this